Policy Coherence for Development, PCD, is an approach and policy tool for integrating the economic, social, environmental, and governance dimensions of sustainable development at all stages of domestic and international policy making. It is the aim of policy coherence for development to make foreign relations to be as ecologically, economically, and socially coherent as possible, and thereby to make international cooperation for international development more effective. Commitments on achieving greater policy coherence to promote development have also been promoted by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, as well as in the 2011 Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, the UN Millennium Declaration, and the 2010 UN Millennium Development Goals Summit. In an era when development assistance is likely to come under more pressure, policy coherence for development, PCD, should become more rather than less important, including in the post-2015 framework, as is increasingly becoming recognized. Depending on the translation, this treaty article was referred to as promoting coherence, E.G. Examples of PCD definitions clarifying this impact focus can be found in the 2005 European Consensus on Development and the 2008 Outcome Document of the UN MDG Summit, both of which link to the MDGs. Under the principles of policy coherence for development, PCD, potential conflicts of objectives and interests between international cooperation and other sectoral policies of the various federal departments should be identified and resolved as far as possible. These may be in the following policy areas: migration policy, agricultural policy, environmental policy, health policy, financial sector policy, security policy, education, research, and cultural policy. The concept of policy coherence for development, PCD, first emerged in discussions among international aid donors in the early 1990s. The term policy coherence for development, PCD, originally emerged from the realization that non-aid policies of donors have an impact on developing countries and should not distract but rather be supportive of international development goals. The PCD concept initially emphasized the responsibility of developed countries to take into account the impact on developing countries when formulating domestic policies across different sectors: trade, finance, migration, security, technology, science. It thus originates from a North-South paradigm with responsibilities for better PCD placed on developed countries to the benefit of developing countries. The debates taking place in the EU and the OECD on promoting PCD have also fostered the understanding that PCD should be enhanced at different levels. These were commonly referred to as internal, intragovernmental, intergovernmental, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, and developing country coherence. PCD operates in a multipolar global economy in which all countries are playing a role in driving global growth and enabling sustainable development. A rapidly changing global economic landscape means every country is facing more complex and interlinked economic, social, and environmental challenges. A better understanding of the linkages of the emerging global trends and their implications is critical for countries as they craft strategies for sustainable development. The OECD expressed political will to ensure PCD as noted its 2008 Ministerial Declaration and in the following 2010 Council recommendations on PCD. Both OECD and EU have put in place systems and tools to define overall ambition and targets, facilitate decision-making and monitor progress, which include institutional mechanisms, monitoring tools, E.G. peer reviews, indicators and reporting, as well as policy toolkits presented as practical measures to achieve progress. Some OECD member states, for example Finland, the Netherlands, have currently developed and piloted self-assessment PCD toolkits. Finland and Switzerland are also testing developing country-level impact assessments in the area of food security. The European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECM, a think tank focused on development cooperation that is based in Maastricht, the Netherlands, argue that policy coherence for development, PCD, is fundamentally a matter of politics. A key dilemma for the countries is how to develop and sustain a level of political interest in and support for PCD, how to put PCD on the political agenda, and to retain momentum and make commitments towards promoting PCD meaningful at both the national and EU level. Although the potential benefits of effective PCD remain unquestioned, ECM argues that political leadership, sponsorship, and focus have waned in recent years in the several countries, even if many of these are considered global leaders in PCD. A recent report from the European Commission states that the European Union has made good progress on policy coherence for development, PCD, at both European and member state level, a fact recognized by the OECD in the most recent, 2012, OECD DAC peer review. It argues that the EU has cemented its position as a global leader in implementing PCD commitments in policy making. It does, however, acknowledge that there is still room for progress in terms of using mechanisms such as impact assessments, evaluation and/or measuring, monitoring progress and reporting on implementation. The Commission argues that the EU remains the lead actor for PCD internationally, ahead of its main partners, with the highest levels of political and legal commitment. More recently, PCD issues have benefited from sustained high-level political attention in the EU and featured more prominently on the agenda of the EU Foreign Affairs Council. The United States and Policy Coherence for Development. Policy coherence for development is among the many criteria for the OECD Development Assistance Committee peer review process. The 2011 DAC peer review of the United States stated that the OECD/DAC describes progress towards policy coherence for development, PCD, as involving three building blocks: I, a political commitment that clearly specifies policy objectives; 2, policy coordination mechanisms that can resolve conflicts or inconsistencies between policies and maximize synergies; and 3, monitoring, analysis, and reporting systems to provide the evidence base for accountability and for well-informed policy making and politics, OECD, 2008a. The 2006 peer review encouraged the U.S. government to develop a more explicit policy on the role of policy coherence for development and to put in place the resources needed to carry out analysis and effectively manage the policy coherence agenda. 5 years on, the U.S. has achieved mixed progress in implementing these recommendations and the three PCD pillars. The OECD argue that national security strategy cannot substitute for a policy coherence for development agenda. She called for the USAID Administrator to be a standing member of the National Security Council, and the U.S. Secretary of State could return actual budget and planning authority to USAID by restoring the USAID Administrator as the dual-hatted Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance. Policy coherence for food security. Food security is a major development challenge, and to address this, the EU amongst others has effectively put global food security high among its development priorities for the years to come. The post-2015 agenda discussions emphasize the need for a universal development agenda that is relevant to the needs of all countries and which is based on shared responsibilities. For this reason, the OECD has reconceptualized PCD and now promotes a wider universal approach and definition of PCD in the context of the post-2015 agenda. They also argue that discussions on PCD have mainly taken place among donors, having focused on coherence between aid and non-aid policies and on a sector-by-sector basis. This has meant focusing on issues with important cross-border dimensions, such as trade, agriculture, investment, health, and migration, amongst others, but without giving attention to the multidimensionality of development challenges. This has been counterproductive for engaging other policy communities and key actors beyond those in development. A paper by ECM argues that the various of the ideas and principles of PCD can be mainstreamed in the post-2015 framework without using strong PCD jargon. These include I, targets for means of implementation in thematic areas that effectively require strengthened PCD efforts; 2, targets in relation to capacity building for more integrated and evidence-based policy making; and 3, efforts to build a strong accountability framework. The paper further concludes that independent from whether a universal PCD concept will explicitly be part of the language of a new framework, real progress on PCD will have to remain a major, if not the most, important component of OECD and EUMS action in achievement of post-2015 commitments. A critique of policy coherence for development. In 2013, the high-profile development blogger Owen Barder wrote a critique of the concept of policy coherence for development entitled "Policy Coherence is a Hobgoblin." He argued that the term PCD has given us an industry of reports and conferences focusing on whether countries have policies which are consistent with each other, and institutions thought likely to make them so, instead of focusing on whether and how those policies are individually supportive of, or inimical to, development.